There we are. It's wonderful to be back to Lund. I have the great honor of having an honorary degree from this university, and I look for every excuse I can to come back. When I got my honorary degree, my then 6-year-old came with me, and he looks for every excuse possible to come back. So I'm grateful to this celebration for inviting me here. I wish I had better news for you, because I fear I bring you stories from a dark future with the hope that we all will find a way to avoid the darkness that we've seen in my own country, the United States. But to see this future, I think we need to step into the past. So I want you to imagine around 1944, as we're in the middle of a great war and the world is imagining, thinking, what does the world need now? And I don't mean in a kind of Dionne Warwick, like, what would be wonderful, what the world needs now, but what would be good, in a very geeky sense, what would be good for a society going forward? And the answer among all who thought about the question was democracy. We should spread democracy everywhere. And indeed, if you look at the history since 1944, democracies have spread everywhere, until the dominant form, overwhelming form of government everywhere is democracy. And today, only rogues would deny the idea of rule by the people. But if you look, in fact, at how governments actually function, is rule by the people is actually not so much. Everywhere, in large democracies around the world, the view is that society is divided between an elite and the people, and the view of the people is that democracy represents the elite. And thus, a core promise of democracy, that it represent us, has failed. And global dissatisfaction with the idea of democracy has never been higher. In the United States, this is the popularity of our main institution of democracy, Congress. It is so low that it's within the margin of error. It could be 0 for all we know. Now, this reality fuels a certain kind of populism. And this populism can be scary. It can be scary for the figures it attracts, but the scary feature of populism for me is not them. What scares me about the populism we see is the growing skepticism among the elite about the idea of democracy. This question, what's wrong with the people, asked again and again among the elite, or as I've heard it put, how could they be so stupid? What scares me is this elite sneer at the populist moment. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to pretend to be a populist. As a Harvard law professor, I make the elite for a living. But this response, this sneer, is obtuse and oblivious, and it misses a critical truth about why we are here, and it misses the urgent need to fix it. We are here in this moment because of something in them, by them I mean government, but importantly also something in us, and by us I mean the people. And my focus today will be primarily on the something in us, because the problem in us ties to the digital. And I fear it's the hardest problem here to fix. Okay, but let's start briefly by focusing on the problem in them. Everywhere, I suggest, in democracies, major democracies around the world, there is this gap, as I've said, the gap between the people and their democracy. Even if the source of that gap is different, the gap is the same. The reason for this separation is different, but the separation is the same. In the United States, the source for this gap is quite specific. In the United States, we take it for granted that campaigns will be privately funded. But because they're privately funded, candidates must raise the money for those campaigns. That process takes time. In the United States Congress, members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars. This is a telephone for any of you kids who don't know what that is. Dialing for dollars, calling people around the country to raise the money they need to sustain their campaign or to get their party back into power. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn what buttons it had to push to get the sustenance it needs. This is the picture of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson learns which buttons he or she must push to get the sustenance his or her campaign needs. This life, this discipline, has an effect. Candidates for Congress and members of Congress develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, this life makes them, molds them into a certain kind of, quote, representative, a representative not of the people, but of the funders. And so who are these funders of the campaigns? Well, we have to think about people who give enough money to matter, people who give enough so that when a candidate is calling, they're thinking, what does this person or this type of person care about? And when you recognize that is their focus and count up the number of people who fit that category, it is a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%. Probably no more than 60,000 Americans are the relevant funders of congressional campaigns, 0.02% of America. So we have a system where members are obsessively focused on the interests of 0.02% of America in order to have the chance to run for Congress and be elected by the rest of America. And the consequence of that system, obviously, is to produce a democracy that is responsive to these funders, and maybe only. The study published by Princeton, which is a Harvard professor I'm not supposed to talk about, so we'll put that off the stage quickly, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page. This is the largest empirical study of the actual decisions of our government in the history of political science. And what they tried to do is to relate the actual decisions of our government to the attitudes of the economic elite, the attitudes of organized interest groups, and the attitudes of the average voter. And so what they found for the economic elite is that the higher the percentage of the economic elite who supports something, the more likely it is that policy was actually enacted. This is the relationship you would expect. The more who support something, the more likely it is it gets passed. It's pretty similar for organized interest groups. The more who supported something, the more likely it was that it got passed. Okay, here's the picture for the average voter. It's a flat line. What that's saying is, it doesn't matter the percentage of the average voter who supports something. It doesn't change the probability of that idea actually being enacted. As the authors put it when describing it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. In a democracy, the average voter does not matter. Right, here's the picture we were taught about our democracy. There we are, kind of middle America. We're supposed to be driving the bus, we the people. Here's the reality of this democracy. The steering wheel has become detached from the bus because of this systemic way in which we steer representatives away from representing the people. This is how our democracy is corrupted. We, the elite, produce a government responsive to the elite and one which we, the people, increasingly loathe. Okay, that's the problem in them. But when you turn to the elite, after describing the problem in them, when you say, look, the government responds to the elite, doesn't respond to the people, what the elite says is, well, this kind of makes sense because you can't trust the people. See, the people are ignorant on a wide range of issues. Why would you ever trust them? Why would you trust us? And the truth is, the elite have a point here. Because, and I'm speaking as American here, right? So we are pretty stupid. What we actually know is pretty embarrassing. We are widely uninformed, biased, confused, ignorant. And poll after poll, not just in America, proves this fact about the people. Whether you think it's Brexit or Donald Trump or even countries like Colombia rejecting what was an incredible peace deal, what we seem to need, at least from the view of the elite, is not more but less democracy, not more democracy, because democracy doesn't seem to be serving the interests of sensible policy making well. So that forces us to think a little bit about us. Okay, what I want you to recognize is that in this criticism of democracy, there is an assumption that stands behind the idea of democracy today. An assumption that once we speak it, once we identify it, will seem obviously absurd. And that assumption is that what democracy means is what we all think now. What all of us, at any particular moment, happen to think about a particular issue right this moment. And we know that, we know what we all think now through things like polls. The polls are said to speak for us. We do a random sample, we ask people questions, they feed back what their view is, and so we, as in everyone, we know now what everyone believes. Now this thought, this assumption is really kind of bizarre. Because why would we all know everything ever, let alone now? Why aren't we all rationally ignorant about all sorts of things? Ignorant, not stupid. Ignorant. Ignorant, meaning something we don't know, but something we could have known or could have understood. We just chose not to understand it. Right? If you asked me about American football, I would demonstrate to you the perfect example of total ignorance. I don't know anything about American football. Now, I don't think I'm a stupid person. I think I could actually understand American football. I could actually learn about it and explain it if I wanted to, but I don't, so I don't. So I'm ignorant about American football. I'm not stupid. Now that distinction is important because in this sense, the people are ignorant. The people are ignorant about all sorts of public policy issues. The people are not stupid, they are ignorant. And of course they are ignorant. Because we all have lives, we have jobs, we have interests, and those interests and lives and jobs are not about politics 24/7. We are ignorant and not stupid, and what's stupid is the idea that something like a poll should be said to represent us. And it's even more stupid today, in the 21st century. In my first work about the internet, I coined a phrase, code is law. I want you to think about the way code is culture. And the way that that code, the technology, the very infrastructure within which culture gets built has changed. So if we think first about the 19th century, we can think about a culture that was radically decentralized. In the United States, there are tens of thousands of newspapers. Every city has 3 or 4 newspapers. These newspapers aren't linked together by telegraph or anything like that. These newspapers are reporting as they locally view them. There's wide diversity in their views. The only thing that gets read uniformly across the country are debates from Congress, because it's the only thing that's offered for free uniformly across the country. Culture in this space is diffuse. And if in that time you had said, what do the people think about a particular public policy issue, that question was unknowable. And indeed, for most people, unimaginable. What would it mean to ask the question, what do the people think? And the point is, if it is unknowable, then this idea of the view of the people becomes invisible. And except at elections, it is irrelevant to public policy. Public policy is engaged in by the elected elite, free of the constraint of the view of what the people might happen to believe. The 19th century then changes pretty dramatically in the 20th century because the technology of culture changes. And it changes in 2 respects I want to flag. First is the birth of broadcasting of all forms, whether that's radio or television or national journals that begin to provide the same story across cultural space. That's the first technology change. And the second is the discovery of the opinion poll. The discovery of a technique for accurately representing the views of the people on any particular issue at any particular time. What the broadcasting means is that for the first time in human history, huge swaths of society are hearing the same story at the same time. Spiro Agnew describes in 1969, at least 40 million Americans every night watch the network news. According to Harris polls and other studies, for millions of Americans, the networks are the sole source of national and world news. And by 1977, the news that is the sole source for most Americans, this broadcast news, 90% of it comes from 3 networks. And these 3 networks aim right down the middle in American society. They're blind to all sorts of important issues, racism, sexism, poverty, no doubt. But they're aiming right down the middle, and they're telling essentially the same story to all of America. And what opinion polls mean is that we can know what the people know. We can ask them. And we know because technology means that what we know is based on a common set of facts, the facts that have been broadcast. Now, that broadcast, again, is not perfect. I'm not idealizing or recommending this world. I'm describing this world. It's not perfect, but the point is, it's not senseless. There's a common knowledge which creates a common sovereignty. The people are knowable, they are respectable, and the view of the people, the idea that there is a view of the people, begins to earn moral weight in democratic discourse. Okay, and then we move quite recently into the 21st century. And the critical thing to recognize about the 21st century, at least in my part of the world, is to recognize how broadcasting has disappeared. We don't have a world where everybody listens to the same story. We increasingly have a world like the 19th century. Here's a graph. It's a little bit hard to understand, but let me describe it. This is cable television versus network television. So the black lines here are the proportion of the audience that is watching network television. The white lines here are the penetration of cable television. And the solid line here is the number of channels on average available to the audience who has or consumes cable television. By 2002, we have moved from a world of 3 major news programs to a world of 340 major news programs. And what's that done is induce a radical fragmentation of attention in the context of news. As described by Elihu Katz, increasing segmentation of audience denies nation-states a means with which to promote social integration and a sense of common purpose. There is a disappearance of the editor, not someone necessarily who's filtering on the basis of political view, but a disappearance of someone who's filtering on the basis of veracity. The ability to say, this is likely true, or at least possibly true, disappears in this space. Now, my view is this diversity is perfectly fine for culture. It's wonderful for culture. The idea that there are 50,000 views of what culture is rich and empowering. And it encourages all sorts of creativity that we ought to be encouraging. It's wonderful for culture. It's the death for democracy. Because what it means is increasingly there is no common story. There is no common account. There is no common set of facts. And worse, what the business model of this fragmented media means is an encouraging of polarization, spinning the stories to attract and solidify an increasingly polarized audience that wants to hear precisely the news you were providing. So Pew in 2015 released a study that tried to identify news sources for different political views. What they found is 47% of conservatives watch one news station or network, Fox News. The liberals break it up among MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, and CNN. The liberals overwhelmingly trust major sources of media. The conservatives overwhelmingly don't trust major sources of media. But the terrifying dynamic was when Pew began to study social media and the dynamics in social media. What they find is that the influencers in social media context are the most extreme in social media context, whether on the left or the right. And as the New York Times began to calculate the polarization of the American public from 1994 until 2010, what they find is that the public, as represented by this diffusion graph here, is increasingly polarized and has been increasingly polarized over the past 15 years. The conditions for a common story, common knowledge, are gone, and yet we live in a time when the people, the view of the people, matters still. It's like the 19th century in the sense that there's fragmentation of the media, but unlike the 19th century in the fact that the people's view continues to matter. We are more relevant to the story than ever. And so you could say we are more relevant while more ignorant. And thus, the elite sneer. The technology has broken us up in the sense of separated us, and broken up our understanding in the sense that there are no common stories, no common facts. Broken us up in the sense that it's made us less than we are. Okay, so that's a depressing story. What is a remedy, if there is a remedy? And so I'll confess I don't yet believe I see the path to a remedy. But I think I see the first elements of what a remedy looks like. So tomorrow I have the privilege of flinging myself from this beautiful place to Mongolia. And I'm flying 6,000 kilometers to Mongolia because the parliament in Mongolia has passed an extraordinary law. This is a law that requires the government in Mongolia conduct regular deliberative polls to determine what the people in Mongolia believe and what they want their government to do. Now, what's a deliberative poll? Well, a deliberative poll is a process where the poller picks a random representative selection, and for the largest polls in Mongolia, that means a random collection of 500 people who are ordered to show up in a particular place. They're then given information about the particular issue, and the poll that will be run next weekend is about amending Mongolia's constitution. So they're given an information packet with arguments on both sides. And then they're given, over the course of a weekend, a chance to deliberate about the information that they've been given. Ask questions, make arguments in small groups and large groups. And the result, the conclusion of this process of deliberation is then referred to Parliament. And if Parliament agrees, it then sends the result out to a referendum for the public to vote up or down. Now, this process of deliberative polling is overseen by a center from Stanford, Jim Fishkin's Center for Deliberative Democracy, and it's deliberative democracy that I want you to think about, the elements of deliberative democracy, and how it contrasts with the process for understanding who the people are we have together. Because the picture that I want to suggest deliberative democracy gives us is what the idea of democracy should mean to us today. Because it is a process for producing judgments that are the conclusion of a certain kind of process, a process within which a representative sample of the people have a chance to learn something, deliberate about that something, and then decide based on their deliberation. And what we need to think here is more of a jury, though a large and representative jury, not of the opinion poll, though it draws from the methodology of the opinion poll a commitment to statistical randomness and representativeness. And my view is this is what we should understand democracy to mean, because those people acting within the context of the deliberative poll are we the people like that. They are not ignorant. They are a large, diverse, informed group of citizens. And what we know from research by people like Scott Page is that that diversity is the ideal mix of deciders for the kinds of issues that are at the core of what public policy must address. And what we need to do, my suggestion, is to find a way to elevate the examples of this kind of democracy and to elevate this sense of us. To bring, or maybe to revive, because the tradition here is a long one, a tradition described by political scientists as sortition, to revive this ideal of the way to understand what we the people believe and to make it a central part of what democracy means. Now, in that process, of course, we can't silence the alternative. You're not going to silence the polls. There will still be polls. There'll be still efforts to represent what we the people are, efforts that play on the ignorant rather than the informed. So we can't silence them, but we can make the process of understanding us better. We can make us better. And in this sense, if we understand and imagine a world where these institutions more frequently stand to speak for what we the people might believe, a fix to the dynamic that I've described here is possible. But my fear is this fix is unlikely. Because this sensible public is harder to see. It's more costly to construct. It's less sexy because less crazy. And the question is, in whose interest is it to build and to fund and to support this alternative? In principle, it's the interest of democracy. One would think the interest of government, but it's not actually the interest of the existing government. since it's just competition to the views of the existing institutions of government. So who builds it and how? And my fear here is these alternatives get marginalized as the experiments of countries we don't call democracies, even though in some rich way they are manifestations of a much better conception of what a democracy could be. That's the fear. But the hope is that as these examples multiply, not just in Mongolia, China has a bunch of these examples. There have been more than 80 of these polls run around the world. France now is experimenting with the idea of a citizen senate, which is a randomly selected senate of citizens to provide a shadow to what the French government does. These alternatives provide a hope for what democracy could be. A hope that starts by recognizing, in a certain way, technology has made us worse, demanding we answer the question, can this technology then find a way to make us better? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll open up for questions from you in just a moment. I'd just like to ask, first of all, this example that you gave from Mongolia, they are actually planning on they're technically bypassing the technical problems that you talked about, because you talked about how social media and how cable TV, for example, has disrupted democracy, and they're not using any of those sources. They're going straight to people show up here, sit in this room, and talk about it. Can you see any way in which technology can, as you said, be used to create that same situation? How that could actually be a help rather than something that destroys?
Yeah, so one of the experiments that's being done with deliberative democracy, deliberative polling, is to test whether virtual deliberative polling is as authentic or effective as real space deliberative polling. And there's good reasons to be skeptical that it would be. I mean, the advantage of a real space deliberative poll, in a room like this, is that there are very few distractions. Right? If you don't allow people to have their iPhones or iPads in front of them, then basically they're focused on what's going on. And if they're focused, then they can be, in a sense, forced to listen and to understand. But if you're sitting at home on your computer and things get a little bit boring, you can pop over to a news site or pop over to Facebook and constantly be distracted, and therefore not able to be forced to confront and to think seriously about the particular issue at hand. And this is, of course, I'm sure all of you have recognized this struggle with technology in your personal life too. The only way I can write is there's this fantastic program called Freedom. What Freedom does is turn off the internet on my computer. So I go into Freedom mode, it blocks the internet for 4 hours, and then I can write, and then it comes back, and I can do all the stuff that wastes my time. But the point is, that architecture, blocking the internet, is an essential part to allowing me to get to a place where I can think and focus and do anything serious. And the test for deliberative democracy is whether we can virtually create the same kind of seriousness that exists when people are in the same room and deliberating. And if we can, then that's really hopeful, because that means the cost of deliberation is much, much less, and we can begin to imagine multiplying, hundreds or thousands of these particular polls in big democracies as a way to get an alternative view of what sensible people think.
Thank you. I'm just going to make a little demonstration here to get you guys involved. This might not look like it, but this is a microphone. It's called a catch box. Anybody seen a catch box before? Some of you have. And that's because it is a box, and you can catch it. When you catch it, you can speak into it just like you were holding an ordinary microphone. You hold it like this, and you talk. So anybody has a question for Professor Lessig and wants to try out the catch box, raise your hand, and I'll throw it right at you. OK, there you go, sir. Yay, very successful. First try.
Thank you. Won't there be a problem with participation bias in these deliberative processes? For instance, in Sweden, we have reinstating our mandatory military service, where one of the recruitment requirements is that also people who are not willing to actually do army service have to be recruited in order to have a representative sample of the population. But I'm guessing you won't like forcing people to actually deliberate.
Oh, no, I love forcing people to deliberate. No, absolutely. That's why I'm a professor. This is my whole mode. No, this is a really critical point. If you set it up just for people who want to do it, then the people who want to do it are not going to be a representative sample of the public. Which is why, with juries in the United States, they are in principle mandatory. Of course, we've allowed rich people to find an easy way out of jury service, but in principle, they're obligations. You've got to show up, and if you don't show up, you get sent to jail. So here too, I think it only works if you find a way to make sure that everybody can participate. Now, that means you've got to make it sure that it's fair to obligate everybody to participate. So if you're a rich rich person with care at home to take care of kids or something like that, then it's easy for you to participate. But if you're a single mom working 2 jobs, that's pretty hard to force you to participate. So I think there's got to be substantial support to make sure that this isn't a burden, because if it's a burden mainly to the poor or middle class. But with that contingency, I absolutely think we have to make sure everybody participates. It's your civil duty. In the old days, your civic duty was to go fight wars. In these days, it's to fight verbal wars, to deliberate. I don't think anything's wrong with that at all.
I think we had another question somewhere here. Yes, will you throw it? Yeah, just go at it once more.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about deliberative democracies, and I recently read a news piece on The Guardian regarding Robert Mercer, who's the billionaire who pretty much funded fake news media all over the United States elections. And I was wondering if deliberative democracy is able to survive such media funding by these plutocrats.
Yeah, that's the reason to be skeptical. Because you have to recognize the business model of everybody in this game favors fake news, right? So, Facebook has been embarrassed by the fake news game, but they didn't do anything about fake news for a long time because it just reinforced the commitment of people to their platform. They clicked more, and every click was money to Facebook. So there's a natural tendency to support the spread of this baseless and unedited reality. And what I'm describing as deliberative polling needs to compete with that. Now, again, I'm not committed to the view that it's possible. I'm just committed to the view that it's necessary. Because the only way we're going to find the force to tampen that down is to find something we can point to as the thing that governments and people, when they're thinking sensibly, ought to be looking at. And to the extent, what we've seen in the United States is we used to have something called news that lived inside of an entertainment industry but had a relative autonomy. But the reality today is that there is no autonomy for news. It is pure entertainment. So in 2015, in August, I spent a lot of time in cable news stations, and constantly they were whining about the fact that Donald Trump was on television 24/7. And I would say, I don't get it. You're putting him on television 24/7. If you don't like it, just don't do it. And they were like, oh, no, we don't have any choice, because if we don't put Donald Trump on our station 24/7, people will just switch to the next station. So the dynamics of the competition force them to the worst behavior imaginable, because they have no autonomy anymore as news. They're just entertainment. Well, if they're just going to be entertainment, we need to create a way to have something that deserves more respect than mere entertainment. Because I want a world where we encourage Mere Entertainment to be as responsive to the weird tastes and wants of people as possible. I want that to flourish in all sorts of diverse ways. But I also want there to be an opportunity for we as citizens inside of a democracy to have a reflective, serious conversation about which way we should go, and to have that count for more than whatever reality TV show happens to be elected president.
This situation with the press or the media not having autonomy, do you see that in other countries too, or do you see that as a more American problem than?
Well, I see it as a lagged function in other countries, right? So, right now you can't look at Europe and recognize this problem in the same way that I'm describing it in America. But I don't see what stops it from becoming the problem in Europe, just like in America. Because there's no legal or technical or even economic way to stop this emerging media of individually driven entertainment control, right? So, you can say we're going to fund public broadcasting in Sweden, keep it at 40% or whatever the percentage is of broadcasting space. But, if people have the freedom to open up their smartphone and go onto Facebook and get their news from Facebook, they're going to do it. And what are you going to do? Make that illegal? You can't have news on Facebook? Or you're going to regulate the news? You're going to have a government agency that looks at the news on Facebook? So the point is, the dynamic I'm describing, I feel like we're the canary in the coal mine, and we have died. Our democracy died. The gas killed us, and you ought to learn something from that and do something in response, because if it spreads, and there's lots of pressure here that it could spread, but if it spreads, then you face the same problem that we have now suffered.
Okay, so we're trying to save the canaries of the future,
right,
sort of.
Right.
Okay. Other questions? Over here, so if you pass it that direction. Yeah,
Hello.
it's the black part, and you
Yes.
raise it to your face. Thank you.
Like this? Yes. Okay, so I was just wondering how deliberative democracy will relate back to polarization, because it seems to me like deliberative democracy or not, polarization will still continue, and eventually we could just come to a point where those who are just the most polarized are the majority, and then that will decide issues anyway.
Yeah, that's a really significant danger, and it's significantly probable it will happen. So again, I'm not overselling hope. I'm being really realistic about how hopeless hope is here. But here's the reason to believe it might be possible to overcome it. In the United States, the polarization of Congress is driven in part, I think in significant part, but in part at least, by the way they fund campaigns. And the reason for that is, they raise money all the time. The day they're elected, the next day, they are raising money for their next election. And when you raise money, the simplest way to raise money is to call the other side the devil. So the built-in bias for fundraising is to vilify. It's the politics of hate. That's the most profitable method for raising money. And so if you imagine people, in a very Foucauldian disciplined sense, disciplined into hating the other side, it's not surprising that the consequence of that is increasing polarization inside of the system. Well, if you change the way you fund campaigns, if they're no longer focused on this life of 2 to 4 hours every day, calling people and telling them why the other party is the party of the devil, you at least open up the opportunity for them to go back to what they were before the 1990s, which was an institution that, like all parliaments, learned to work with each other. Indeed, better than most parliaments, because parliaments build in the idea, or parliament in the kind of British model, build in the idea of a militant opposition, but the American Congress never had that idea as a central idea. There really was this notion that you're elected, but then you compromise to pass laws that are actually the compromise of the positions elected. It's possible to imagine us getting back to that. And the same thing in the media. I've described a market force that drives towards polarization, MSNBC and Fox News. This is like the best way to get that kind of media. But to the extent what's important in public discourse is not just those media sources, but to the extent it's also something that's by design less likely to polarize, it's possible that the effect or the incentive to polarize in that space becomes weaker. Now, again, maybe not, maybe probably not, but I don't know the other alternative. I mean, when I talk about democracy, I always get, I was just in France, I just spoke in France, and I always get a question of this form. A woman raised her hand and said, maybe the problem is too many people vote. We should just eliminate voting, or just pick the people who should be voting, by which she meant the elite, just make it so the elite vote. Or, many people look at China or even Singapore and Switzerland, and you say, well, we just have a different conception of democracy, where democracy is focused more on governance and less on debate or discussion or argument. And those are natural reactions to the failure of democracy, and what I want to do is find a way to fix democracy so we don't go down the path of those natural reactions.
We have another question over there, and after that we're going to pass it to the back because I can see your hand there.
Thank you. The reason I'm a bit skeptical about this argument that technology has made us worse is because I feel like the analysis didn't take into account access to media, like access to broadcasting, whether as broadcasters or as receivers of this information. Because the people who were accessing this media and participating actively in democracy in the 60s certainly aren't the same as the people who are doing that now. In terms of diversity, in terms of reach, and all of that. Just to bring an example from a totally different context, like the government of Saudi Arabia, for example, funds hundreds of TV channels all around the world, while no Saudi citizen is able to start their own channel in Saudi Arabia. And I'm sure, I know that freedom of speech is guaranteed in the US, but I'm sure there are other more powerful ways of controlling free speech other than laws. So is the problem is that we're looking at technology are we trying to blame technology or scapegoat it when there are other problems that might be causing this?
It's a great question. So I took for granted something that maybe I shouldn't take for granted. I've spent my whole academic career as a promoter of the internet and technology. This has been my shtick. It's this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And you guys don't like sliced bread, but still, in America, we like sliced bread, okay? It's just extraordinarily good for all sorts of things. So what I was hoping is that, against the background of this perpetual apologist for technology, let me be skeptical about one really important dynamic that we've seen emerge here. Because, whereas when I go back and I actually don't do this, but if I imagine going back and reading my old books, it would be terrifying to do that. But if I did that, much of the argument there I wouldn't really touch. There was a very important, the point that I wanted people to focus on is the relationship between architecture and policy and the need constantly to have a trade-off there to preserve the policy that you wanted. But when we talked about free speech back then, we kind of imagined that you just open up the channels and utopia would flow. Everything would be wonderful. If people just were not constrained and they could speak their mind, then there would be lots of flourishing of great ideas and there'd be lots of progress towards a better world. What we didn't think about, or at least I didn't think about, probably many people here did, but what I didn't think about when I was celebrating this future was the incredibly important role that editors played. Editors are not censors. Editors are not people, I don't mean the people who say, this is too left-wing, so we're going to block this, or this is too right-wing, we're going to block. I mean the people who say, you can't say 3 million illegal votes caused Hillary Clinton to beat Donald Trump. This thing our president says, that but for the 3 million illegal votes, he would have won the popular vote. That sort of thing no respectable journalist could publish because the publisher, the editor, would say, there are no facts behind this. There's just nothing behind this. And what we didn't think about is what happens if you open up an architecture where it's easy to spread baseless claims and affect a democracy based on those baseless claims because the role provided by editors is gone. And that's a particular version of the problem that I'm describing here. Now, my view is not, okay, therefore let's shut down the internet, or let's go back to the days of 3 television stations. That's the view of some, but my view is not that. I think the internet's here, we have to embrace it and love it. The question is, what can we complement the system with to compensate for problems that I think we have to recognize are there? It is a real problem that there is no check for truth. And especially in the United States, there's no nonpartisan check for truth because truth is now relative to which side of the political spectrum you're going to stand on.
I think we have a hand. Yes, almost at the very back. So you might need to sort of help it across. So you throw it as far as you can, and the next person helps. Raise your hands, you who want it.
It's kind of like packet. This is the way packets get sent across the internet. Oops,
yes.
Not like that.
Yeah, that was pretty good, actually. I think, no, actually, it's right behind you. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does it work? Sorry. Thank you for a really inspiring talk. One of the concerns that I have, and I didn't really hear you touch upon, was the way that the spaces where public deliberation, news consumption, et cetera, unfold today, basically is within a few platforms, commercial platforms that are driven not by public interest, but by completely different incentives, the personal information economy, and the way that that radically transforms public life, public discourse, public deliberation, that it is now part of a economic business model that is completely different from the way that we've thought about news and public interest, et cetera, up until a few years back.
I completely agree with you. And let me just, I think that there's a link. Let me see if I can make it clearer. So when I was describing all of the incentives that are now breaking down the possibility of a balanced or reflective discourse, those are all private market incentives, right? So one way I was describing cable television, which creates these completely private broadcasting spaces, small broadcasting spaces. In the old days, Walter Cronkite would speak to millions in a night, and in the modern time, if you get 700,000 watching you, that's a success on cable news. So it's not as big, but the point is that's private incentives there that drive to that polarization. And the same thing, I suggest, happens in the context of fake news in Facebook. Why is fake news in Facebook flourish? Because it's in the incentive of the provider to give people things they want to click. From one perspective, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. If you serve up ads for stuff I want and I click on it, that's a good way to measure you're delivering what I want. But if you talk about democracy and what you're doing is providing stuff that makes it impossible for me to understand the truth, we understand that to be a bad thing. So again, I think it's a product of these private incentives. Now, the question is, well, what's the alternative to that private world? And I don't believe it's possible to imagine going backwards. It's not like we're going to eliminate it, or we're going to go back to just public television. So what I was describing with the deliberative polls was the construction of a new public space. It's not a public space we're all going to be occupying at any one particular time. But my belief is that if we can regularize it and make it an event that comes into being constantly, then it's not a bad public space. It's a public space where we basically say to our fellow citizens, okay, spend a couple days or a week trying to understand this particular issue and reflecting on it, and make your views known and thank you for your service. So it's the construction of an alternative public space defined by public norms that doesn't entail imagining destroying all the private space that's already been produced. And all of that's not to say we ought to be sanguine about the private space. I mean, the other big way the internet's completely different from what we imagined is it's not an internet. It is Facebook and Twitter and Google space and Microsoft space. It's all sorts of domains governed by their own laws. Somebody at dinner last night was talking about Mark Zuckerberg running for president, and then somebody else said he already is president of 1.7 billion people. Why would he want to be United States president of only 300 million people, right? So there's a real sense in which they've created these new competing sovereignties, and it's not clear who has the power to take on those sovereignties. And I think that, for independent reasons, is a really serious concern. But I completely agree with your framing, because what I'm describing in deliberative polls is an effort to construct public space that might compete with the consequence of that private space.
Okay, so we have one hand there, close, so you can grab the box, and after that, it'll be over there.
I have one comment which I think the internet functions very well to get a good sort of objective view, and that is Wikipedia, where people are constantly debating and putting this forward. Why can't this? I think this is the best sort of way that internet is working. Why couldn't this work for more things?
Well, I think you're right. Wikipedia is a great example, but let's understand the elements of that example. First, there are no ads on Wikipedia. And the reason Jimmy Wales refused to allow ads in Wikipedia is he didn't want the management of Wikipedia to feel it needed to bend its rules to making ads work. So there's no ads, and there's a very strong norm for editors in Wikipedia. I mean, if you write on Wikipedia, there's very strict rules about the mental frame you've got to place yourself in when you're writing. You've got to adopt the perspective of neutrality. And the philosophers will say, oh, there's no such thing as neutrality. Tell that to Jimmy Wales, because he built Wikipedia on the basis of this frame of neutrality. And you have to write in a way that tries to give fair representation and only can cite things that you have real authority for. So these are norms that are built into the community, and it's been extraordinarily successful based on those norms. So going back to the question for the woman behind you, that is the set of values that we want public space to embrace. But I, again, think it's no accident that it survives because it doesn't lock itself into a commercial model. The commercial model would kill it, because as its managers, executive directors would, be watching the success or failure of Wikipedia, it would be measuring it according to these metrics of commercial success. And that would change dramatically the character of that space. There's a wonderful book by Tim Wu. I can't remember the title. It's his latest book. But it tells the story of news media in the United States. It tells us a bunch of things, but one part of the story is about news media in the United States and the rise of the ability to measure what people are watching and what they're not watching. And the story he tells is exactly what I'm suggesting would happen to Wikipedia. When there's no ability to measure or no commitment to measuring what people are watching on the news, then the editors of the news show basically tell the news according to what they think the people need to see. Now, of course, there's lots they're oblivious to. They don't cover poverty enough. They don't cover race enough. They don't cover sexual equality enough. But still, they think that it's important to understand what's going on in foreign policy, and they tell a story about foreign policy that's comprehensive and complete so the public can understand it. But then you get the ability to measure what people are actually interested in, and it turns out that they don't want to hear very comprehensive stories about what's going on in foreign policy. So there's pressure on the news editors to change their content because you can measure how the public reacts to it. And, that's ambiguous. On the one side, you can say, well, the public ought to get what the public wants. On the other side, you could say, but the public needs to understand certain issues of public import, so it's not a great thing that you allow yourself to shut down that conversation merely because it allows you to sell more valuable ads. I think this is always inherent in a commercial platform, which means we can't trust the commercial platform to provide every public good, which again I think is the motivation of the question behind you, which isn't reinforcing or finding ways to reinforce public spaces an important part of the solution. It is. Just recognizing public spaces won't look like what they did in the 20th century and the 19th century.
Over there.
Good throw. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a question on the first step of this process of deliberative polls. In informing people, we're inherently affecting their opinions. So who gets to decide what information they will receive to both protect minority opinions but also be balanced?
It's the most important part of the process. And so what Fishkin has done, he's been running these for, I think, 30 years now. What they've done is they've established a pretty elaborate procedure to poll interview the relevant public to identify what is the range of input necessary so that you have what is understood and is a balanced view. And the whole success or failure of the enterprise depends on them presenting something which people stand back and say is a fair view. So it depends on passing the Wikipedia test, in the sense that people believe you have provided in a neutral way the information necessary for people to understand it. But you're absolutely right. That is the critical step to make this work.
More hands in the air? Yeah, sure. Pass it over there, and then we'll let it move forward like this.
Hi. This is really, really important. Thank you for a very good talk. First, vision. Okay, so if we make a public space, we need to that.
Raise the microphone a little bit. I think that might be the problem. Thank you.
So in Sweden, we have a fairly strong public service. So my first question is, what do you see can be done to strengthen public service in the interest of truth and neutrality? And the other side, we need to protect it from like fake news and things like that. And in Germany now, for instance, they are proposing laws to regulate Facebook, for instance, so that they get fined if they spread too much fake news, etc. So where do you see the opportunities of concrete measures to regulate the kind of the commercial strength that might impose negatively on the public space? So how to strengthen the public space and how to regulate the commercial side?
So you strengthen public space by being creative and innovative about building new public space. You got to give up the idea that by public space what we mean is better parks or broadcast television that everybody watches. That's just the old days. I mean, we ought to have good parks, and it is nice to have good public television, but that can't be all. We've got to find new public space that conforms to the values of the public space and instantiates a real public in that space. So that's on that side. With respect to the laws, I'm all for it. I mean, it is a commercial interest that encourages these companies to allow fake news to spread. Change the commercial interest. And if you change the commercial interest, they'll behave differently. So I know Facebook is deeply motivated to try to find a way around this. But in the United States, they're motivated merely for political reasons. They just don't want to be seen as a tool of either the right wing or the left wing. The First Amendment restricts the ability of the government to actually regulate Facebook directly. But, doesn't in Germany, doesn't in France, doesn't in Italy. So let's, do it in lots of places where they begin to have the incentive to make sure that there's something balancing it. But in doing that, we have to worry about one of the issues which at the very beginning of the study of cyberspace was our obsession, which is, when we were originally thinking about this move from the public spaces to the private spaces, the main concern was what we called then censorship. And by that we meant, the decision of the platform to exclude certain content, which was effectively unreviewable because there was no free speech mandate that applied to those platforms. And so I think we need to, make sure we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? We've got to make sure that in insisting on controlling or them controlling certain content according to certain norms, we don't encourage the creation of the censorship model that we in the beginning of talk about the internet were so eager to avoid. And that means, in the context of regulating, building into that regulation the ability to challenge restrictions. So, in the context of America, you'll typically have the woman who's in charge of censoring in Facebook, who's a really powerful, really smart, brilliant woman, trotted out at conferences, and she'll describe the work that they're doing to keep child predators off of Facebook, or how they block terrorists and all that sort of work. And in the context of what she talks about, it's hard to say this, but in response to her describing her work, one wants to say, but how do we know you get it right? And what happens when you get it wrong? What's the process for making sure that when you've blocked a, quote, child pornographer, you haven't just blocked a father who shared pictures of his kid with the kid's mother, right? I mean, so, and the answer to that is, from their perspective, very minimal process to make sure that they're getting it right, because from their perspective, getting it wrong is just a cost of doing business. But from the standpoint of public values, getting speech restrictions wrong is a really important problem. And there has to be really significant investment to make sure that we're not overly restricting access to speech. And again, the natural tendency of the private space is not to do that well enough.
There? Oh, yeah, hands in the air. There you go.
I would like to align, hold on, got my notes here, between fake news, post-truth, and illegality and illegal behavior. So from fake news to, for example, trolling or harassment online. And I'm wondering whether you see that the domain of law and legality has shifted by an acceptance of post-truth, whether there's a risk of this. And I guess underneath this is just a fundamental unease with what might be an acculturation or an acceptance of this term post-truth, almost a trivializing of it. And I'm wondering if within this whole domain that you've sketched out, whether there can be a proximity between fake news and post-truth and the law, or whether you actually are comfortable that there's some sort of safety barrier there.
Well, I think that we have to pragmatically recognize the difference these commercial entities have to policing each of these problems. So they don't have a natural tendency to want to police fake news, because the more fake news, the more clicks they get. That's benefit to them. But if you think of the evolution of online communities, creating online communities where people can feel safe and respected has been the direction of the market, right? Facebook's critical innovation over everything else is that you were a real person with a real name. And they police very hard the efforts to hide who you are. And so your reputation becomes critical, and it's very hard then for you to escape the consequences of bad behavior. And that's in their interest, because they want a community where people aren't going to go beating up on each other all the time. That was in their design. So the trolling behavior, I think it's an important problem, especially to the extent it's primarily borne by minorities and people who are other. The trolling behavior is a very serious problem, but it's less. There's less of a conflict of interest with the interests of the platform. So I think there's a reason to be concerned and to have oversight and to assure there's sufficiently aggressive regulation, internal regulation there. But there's more reason to be worried in the context, I think, of things like fake news, where the incentive of the company is to support the behavior we think is bad.
I think we had a hand over here. Is that right? Okay. Anybody else? We have time for a couple more. Well, okay, over there then. Pass it right across the room. You have to hold up your hand so they can see where to throw it. There you go. And once more. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you so much for a very interesting speech and also Q&A. I would like to go back to the regulation discussion that we had earlier. And regulating commercial landscape, it starts in the notion that government is good, and also in some way also that national legislation can fix things. And at the same time, we know public space is digital, knows no national borders. Facebook talks of global average in their policies sometimes. How do we find a supranational regulation that embraces the fact that some governments are at least trying to work in the public interests, and some will and are using regulation against freedom of speech.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, it's a really hard question because it's almost impossible today to glimpse the world where we feel confident about world government in some sense. So that means it's hard to glimpse a time where we're beyond the place where we believe some governments are trying to do good and others are trying to do bad. I mean, I know I'm in Europe because you've suggested there are some governments that are trying to do good. In America, nobody would suggest such an idea. They would say all governments are trying to do bad. That's basically the American view. But yeah, I am with you. I do think there are some that are trying to do good, and the challenge is to figure out how that mix of governments interacts with what are really much more powerful sovereigns out there, namely these commercial entities like Facebook or Google or AT&T, right? So the reality is we have this picture that the power starts at governments and goes down, but the reality is the power is these commercial entities, and you have these pathetic governments trying to, to wrestle them to the ground when they're doing bad, or or support them when they're doing good. And what's really challenging then is to figure out how to get governments to get their act together, right? Because what they've got to realize is that there's no chance that Sweden fixes any problem of Facebook, just no chance. And there's probably not much chance that all of Europe fixes any problem with Facebook, right? Because the power of Facebook is so great relative to these governments, and the ability to evade is so pronounced. But if we recognize that individual governments are disabled, and we believe that the idea of world government or the UN doing something is almost incomprehensible right now, then it really requires active collaboration among the better of these governments to try to figure out how to work with these companies to reassert sovereignty. Right? I mean, this is going back to the wonderful question about public spaces. This is the reality, right? The presumption of sovereignty at the core of the way we live has been displaced by this consumer sovereignty, which now is the most important force regulating our behavior, right? If I wrote code is law, that's insufficiently descriptive in a world where 98% of the relevant code is owned. And so it's not code is law, it's commercial code is law. And what is that world where basically our life is primarily regulated in these private spaces rather than some place that has to answer to public norms, which I think is the ideal that we still sustain, at least in some corners of Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one last and please very brief question before we need to round off. There you go.
My question is about when you talk about deliberative democracy, I suppose democracy is all about participation also, so bringing people together. So I could watch this live streaming back from my country, but I came here just to see your expression because I'm the human being. And from our culture, we call it the human touch that creates the spiritual part that detects the very human emotion and comes to a conclusion about what is truth and what is wrong. So my question is, through this deliberative democracy and the help of the technology, how can bring the actual human being face to face, and if needed, how we can bring people into real life street if any regime gets oppressive.
Yeah. So as I said, there's this experiment to see whether virtual deliberative democracy would work. I am skeptical that it will, not just for the architectural reasons that I was talking about, but primarily for the social or human reasons that you're talking about. When I've seen these contexts, these processes happen, the most amazing part of the dynamic is when humans of radically different backgrounds have to interact with others, and they have to come to an understanding, and they do come to an understanding, and they have this experience of, aha, I can actually talk about something with people I disagree with and come to some common ground. That is a very real space experience, and I'm not yet convinced, though I'm open to being convinced, that we can replicate that in the virtual space. But if it's true that we've got to do it in the real space, that becomes an essential part of it. Then again, what I think we need to do is to become creative about multiplying the number of contexts where we can see something like this happen. So in the Mongolian model, they imagine deliberative polls at the national level, at the regional level, at the town level, at the neighborhood level. And each of them has a different size. The smallest is like a 20-person deliberative poll. But what I think that they envision is that if you can regularly engage in this process, it will affect how you think of your role as a citizen. And there's some empirical data to support this dynamic. In the United States, the experience of serving on a jury significantly affects the jurors, the post-jurors, or the ex-jurors' commitment to civil life. So they vote more frequently, they go to town meetings more frequently, they do all the sorts of things that you expect a citizen should do more frequently once they've served on a jury. And in the beginning of America, those who served on juries, which of course were white males, typically property owners, but those who did qualify for jury service, on average served on a jury 3 times a year. So this was a regular part of their life. And so I think what I'm suggesting is, for the reasons that you begin with, we need to make it a real part of citizens' lives. We need to do it regularly, maybe not 3 times a year, but once every 3 years would be enormous for everyone to be participating in something like this. To give people the experience of something other than a Facebook feed, and understanding people as something other than people who agree with me, but instead a community that we have to find a way to work with. And that is the critical democratic experience, right? We think, because we look at politicians, that democracy is about winning elections. But democracy is about learning to work and live with people who disagree with you. That's why there is democracy. How do people who don't have the same views work it out together? And we need to practice that more in our life. And I think the flaws that digital have introduced, I hope, will inspire us to practice it much more in real space life for exactly the reasons you've said. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you. Hold on for a moment.
Oh, beautiful.
We're really happy to have had you speak for us today here. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for participating. We are now breaking for coffee for 30 minutes. At 11 o'clock, we restart here for the Lund presentations, and you'll see Professor Lessig again after that. Thanks.
Thanks.